Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Winder with Aerstone. I'm here today with John Pettyjohn, also with Aerstone.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about DFARS compliance, specifically some of the new DFARS regulations on safeguarding covered defense information. In summary, there is a new DFARS regulation in play, which applies to all Department of Defense and intelligence community contractors. This new regulation requires that these organizations complete a NIST 800-171 compliance audit, and we'll talk a little bit today about what that entails, as well as implement a cyber reporting program for any discovered incidents to the Department of Defense. Compliance is required by the end of this calendar year, and ultimately meaning that if you don't comply, it may impact your business. First, a little bit about Aerstone. We are a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business with offices across the country. We are one of only 5 NSA-certified vulnerability assessors under the NSA's new CIRA accreditation program. We effectively provide the full life cycle of cybersecurity support, including assessment, enhancement, and sustainment services for a variety of customers, both public and private. Today, we're going to be talking about the new DFARS regulation, who's affected and who's covered, and then ultimately lay out a path to compliance, including the protective measures, incident reporting, and other requirements that must be implemented again by the end of this calendar year 2017. First, introduction. The DFARS is a set of regulations that supplement the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Many federal agencies have their own supplements to the FAR, and the Department of Defense set is specific to any organizations doing business either directly or indirectly with the Department of Defense. The specific new regulation in play is titled Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. It was added to the DFARS in October of 2016 and ultimately finalized at the beginning of this year. It requires that all DoD prime contractors and subs achieve full compliance by the end of this calendar year with 2 core compliance requirements. First, implementing adequate security, and we'll talk about what that means, and then also ensuring that they conduct cyber incident analysis and reporting, and we'll dive into a little bit about what that means as well. First, who's affected? In order to ensure that sensitive government information is properly protected, they've decided that any quote-unquote covered contractor information system is covered. That means in practice any network that's owned and operated either by or for the contractor or related to, quote, the performance of the contract. Obviously, that latter requirement is rather vague and can be extended to mean quite a bit of things. We'll give some examples in just a second of what specifically might be at play. But in terms of the actual networks that are affected, literally any network that's operated either for or by the contractor or on behalf of the contractor is covered. Now, in terms of what's covered, the DFARS lays out 4 different kinds of information that are required to be covered. First is controlled technical information. Controlled technical information is effectively any information with either a military or space application that's subject to controls on its access, use, modification, release, or dissemination. That really is rather broad, but it is limited at least to military or space applications. Second, OPSEC information. Operation security information is any information that can give an unfair advantage to adversaries, ultimately that could guarantee failure or unacceptable consequences for the program. In practice, this is actually very broad. It can include staff rosters. It could include project plans, statement of work. It can include invoices, or really any information that could be publicly available that's not actually classified, but which in aggregate could give an adversary the ability to disrupt either the content, the cost, or the delivery time frame of a DoD program. Third, the regulation covers export-controlled information. ITAR is simply a set of government regulations on the export and import of defense-related articles and services. ITAR information is clearly known as ITAR information and has always been considered sensitive and should always be controlled carefully. And then finally, any additional information that the contracting officer identifies in the contract can also be covered. Together, these four categories cover quite a lot of information that relate, in many cases, just vaguely to the operation of a particular program. It should be noted, incidentally, that sometimes information in aggregate can be substantially more sensitive to single pieces of information. So, for example, a single NSA phone number is considered unclassified. However, the entire NSA phone book is classified secret, no foreign. This notion of data aggregation is important in terms of giving adversaries a capability to affect the outcomes of a program, and is partially behind the government's interest in controlling the networks and validating the security of the networks that are used to hold this kind of information. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to John Pettyjohn, Aerstone's penetration test team lead, to talk about the specific path to compliance with this DFARS statute. John?
Hey, thanks, Jason. Again, my name is John Pettyjohn. I'm also an assessor for Aerstone, and I've actually done a couple of DFARS assessments for a few customers for us. So I've actually done a few of these assessments for our customers. Essentially, diving into what the regulations are, the clause 204-7012 really has three main directives. The first being, safeguarding defense information. The second being reporting the DoD after being awarded a contract, your deficiencies with 171. And the third being the ability to report effectively incidents. And as I'll dive into specifically how DoD wants that to happen. But the main lift is the very first directive, is essentially protecting and safeguarding the information. And that really points to the NIST publication 800-171, which is designed and written for protecting CUI, or controlled unclassified information. So diving a little more into that, 171 literally is a subset, if you're familiar with the NIST 853 series. What they did was they took out 79 controls really centered around protecting confidentiality, and also selected 14 of the standard security control families, your access control, your auditing, configuration management. So essentially, if you're familiar with the 853 assessment, this is basically a scaled down version of that type of an assessment. So you essentially would need to have all those controls implemented, whether it's documentation or some type of a technical control. Diving a little more into the second directive of incident reporting. So the clause really wanted very specific definitions on how organizations report their incidents. And the clause goes on to defines what an incident is. It says here in the slide, I won't really go into all of that. Also, the reporting requirements are very specific. And if you go to the clause itself, there's a link to the DoD site, which actually has the criteria for all the reporting for incident response. And the third being, even to report an incident, your organization must have a DoD-approved medium assurance certificate. Essentially, you have to go to one of the medium assurance certificate providers that actually gives out these CAs that you need to import to actually access the DoD's incident response portal. So a few lessons learned. So essentially, having done this a few times, we have some lessons learned. We've come to find that you really want a third-party confirmation. It's really better than doing it yourself. It's kind of like you don't want to check your own work. Also, perfection isn't required standard. We're not looking to satisfy all 79 controls. I think the important thing to note here is that you need to have showed either your prime or the government itself that you're actually gone through the compliance process by undergoing an assessment. And for those controls that you may not have an implementation for, you develop some type of a plan of action. Some things we also saw that just moving into the cloud doesn't solve all your problems as well. It may allow you to inherit a lot of these physical security controls and other maybe personnel controls, but also may introduce other risks. And some other things we learned is that most of the problems we see, from deficiencies in 171 is configuration management and policy. I want to say that 60 to 70% of complying with 171 is having the right policy documentation. And don't be clever. There's some wiggle room within some of these controls that NIST lays out, but I wouldn't go as far as saying putting up a security awareness poster constitutes your security awareness plan. So there are some things that you're going to have to end up doing to be compliant. Next slide here, kind of go through the anatomy of how we do a DFARS assessment. What we like to do is we like to start off with a readiness assessment. Before we dive right into the 79 control full assessment, especially for organizations who've never gone through that type of assessment, you're really setting yourself up for failure. So what we offer is a readiness assessment. We'll actually send out like a checklist of all the documentation that usually you need to have to help you get compliant. We do a 1 to 2 day kind of a working session and kind of like interview the folks in charge of your security and your security policies to kind of give a snapshot of where you would stand up against a real assessment. And we would also, using that information, we generate a readiness report to kind of give you a set of action items that you can begin working on before the full assessment. Now, after a certain period of time, when you think you're ready for the full assessment, you've addressed some of those action items we identified, we'll actually do the full assessment. And this could be anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks. This could entail on-site technical testing, interviews, documentation review, everything that you need to do to kind of how you line up against the 171 controls. And then we give you another week or two, or however long you need to address those items, and then we issue a full package, which concludes your DFARS report and a program of actions and milestones. And essentially, this package would constitute your deliverable to show compliance for DFARS. I think that leads us to questions and answers.
Yep, thank you very much, John. And we actually have a couple of questions here. The first question that came across is, are subcontractors responsible for implementing these safeguards? And the answer is yes. Any company doing business with the Department of Defense, and that includes not just prime contractors, but also subcontractors, and really a company doing any kind of work for the DoD. That doesn't necessarily have to be information technology work or aerospace or specifically military-related work. It could be even commodity services like running the kitchen or facility services. Any DoD contractor or subcontractor is on the hook to go through these assessments and complete them. There's a second question here which says, what's the time frame for completing these assessments? I think that question means it could either mean how long does it take to do the assessment or how often is it done. So I'll answer both questions. As John was talking to the order in which the timeline for completing one of these assessments, I'll jump back to the slide. Really, it takes as long as it takes to complete the remediation is probably the easy answer. Our part of it is usually broken up into 2 phases: an initial readiness assessment at the beginning for 1 to 2 weeks, then finally a final proper audit that takes anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the size of the environment. In terms of how often this needs to be done, it needs to be done on a yearly basis. Now, obviously, after you do it once, it should be much faster and easier to do these audits moving forward. The second time you do it, it's largely a matter of checking to ensure that the artifacts still exist, to check through any plans of action and milestones that are created specifically for the environment and ensure that they're ensure that they're fully remediated. Another question here that asks, what is the penalty for non-compliance? That is specifically at the discretion of the contracting officer. This is a relatively new statute, so it's going to be difficult to know exactly how seriously contracting officers will take the statute. My guess is that it'll be a mixed bag, and it'll depend very heavily on the criticality of the service being offered, as well as the personal feelings of the contracting officer. I certainly can imagine that this will be a great tool for contracting officers to get rid of incumbents or contractors that they don't feel are performing. It'll be a simple way to dismiss an existing contractor. So the most likely penalty will be loss of business. It might also result in a non-compliant proposal. Since this is a DFARS supplement, anyone submitting a proposal on a DoD request for quotation has to comply with these DFARS and FAR regulations, and any non-compliant vendor could be dismissed immediately. The next question I have here reads, how does the government expect a small company to dedicate valuable resources to accomplish this task? What is the general cost, and how do we, the company, recoup these costs? Well, that's a fantastic question, and certainly there is a burden that the government is placing on industry here. In terms of the general cost, it varies wildly. Depending on the size of the organization, it could be as little as $5,000 for much larger organizations, as much as $250,000. So it really depends on the size and the complexity of the organization. I think for the audits that we've done so far, John, I think we're seeing somewhere in the 20 to 40K ballpark for relatively medium-sized organizations.
Yeah, even as low as 15 to 40.
15 to 40, yeah. So that depends, and it's been companies in the $5 to $50 million kind of range.
We've done assessments on really small companies,
Yeah.
30 to 50 employees tops.
Yeah, and that came in at about 15K?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's probably a good floor then.
And also, to add to that too, and this, I think DFARS is just a kind of a precursor. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think, isn't the trend moving towards the FAR itself?
Yes,
going to be
absolutely, and we've actually seen that the GSA has already told us, publicly announced that they intend to incorporate this statute into the FAR at large, meaning that they said within about 2 years that it'll apply to any organization doing business with the federal government. And to answer the spirit of the gentleman's question, I think that the government believes that the risk of exposing sensitive information is greater than the cost that they're levying on small business to comply. I think this is an example of the government taking leadership on an issue that they feel strongly is in their best interest to encourage. Certainly the government makes us do quite a lot of things that in some cases we'd rather not do. And this is, I think, is one more example of them just deciding that the risk was just too great in aggregate.
the price of doing business with them.
Yeah, so this is ultimately a cost of doing business. And how do companies recoup these costs? They win contracts that are hopefully profitable and ultimately grow their business.
It may add, the assessments we've done have actually been with companies who are the subcontractors to a larger prime, and it was the prime themselves requiring this assessment take place. So that requirement was pushed down to the sub.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it is a certain lift. It is not an excruciating lift. This is not millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's small companies will definitely feel it. And that's part of the reason, by the way, that we've structured our assessments the way we have. Certainly, if companies want to just do our readiness assessment and then take it from there themselves, we're happy to do that. I think companies are just going to have to ask themselves whether that's the kind of work they want to spend their time doing compared to other value-added work that only they can do. Certainly that's always the challenge with the small business is, do you do it yourself or do you pay to have it done? And I can certainly see some companies deciding that they just simply don't want to spend the money and want to do it themselves. In which case, we can do some training, get companies kind of started down the right path, and let them do their thing.
And also, let me add, one of the assessments we done was a company that had no idea what a FSMA assessment was, but since they were in the state of Massachusetts, they already had a lot of these artifacts and policies written for some of the Massachusetts requirements for security. So we were able to leverage those documents and policies. So sometimes when you think you're so far off the mark, you're not even close to compliance, you may very well have some of these things already in place. And that's what the good thing about the readiness assessment is. It kind of gives you, where you stand now.
Yep. And we have another question here that asks, what kinds of things are actually audited? So I think that's referring to the control families and the specific controls that comprise the NIST 800-171 control families. As John mentioned earlier, there are 14 control families with a selection of 79 controls across those families. And those families range from media protection, like how you safeguard physical media, to policies related to breaches, to how you manage system access points, logging and traceability, system settings and configuration. It's not a bad series of controls. And the thing is, really, any organization should be spending some time and money thinking about how they safeguard sensitive information. Every organization has sensitive information, and certainly some amount of time and money should be put into safeguarding it. Now, how much? Obviously, that depends on the organization, the business model, the sensitivity of the data, the risk to the company if there's a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. There's an assumption with NIST 171 of a moderate baseline, which may or may not correspond to the company's reality, but they had to do something, and that's the standard the government picked. At the end, it's going to make companies more secure and ideally make them effectively able to compete better and survive better. Granted, forcing companies to spend the money when they don't necessarily want to, that's another question.
Let me add too that some of the companies we've done assessments were actually appreciative. They weren't cringing at the findings. We're actually like, this is a good catch, and this is something we probably should be doing anyway. And and also the people we work with directly are the folks who are actually been wanting to do some of these things anyway, and now have the kind of ammunition to, great, I've always wanted to configure my firewall this way, and now you're telling me I have to, so that's great.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that there are obviously, depending on the industry, there are other regulations which in some cases do have teeth. So if you're talking about a company that's has to be compliant with the red flags regulations in the financial services industry, or with HIPAA, or any of a myriad of industry-specific security requirements, there's very strong overlap here. So for some companies, certainly there'll be some sort of double dipping in terms of implementing controls that satisfy multiple sets of regulation. It's also worth mentioning that just about any company that offers health insurance to its employees is required to be covered by HIPAA. That's actually HIPAA information, HIPAA-sensitive information, and so certain controls that are required for HIPAA have to be implemented in terms of safeguarding personnel security, personnel information, and that's part of the control guidance of NIST 800-171. So with that said, if there are no other questions, I think we are just about out of time. I will stop it here and thank everybody for their time and participation. If anyone has any more questions in general, if you'd like to schedule a free compliance consultation, or if you'd just like to chat cybersecurity, we're always available. You can reach us via info@aerstone.com, or feel free to use the contact form on our website, www.aerstone.com. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and attendance, and wish you all a good afternoon.